My guest and I delve deep into actual histories to find situations and scenarios you can use in your tabletop RPG campaigns.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. You know what, guys? I have a free campaign toolkit that is on drivethrurpg.com. It is called The King's Road. Yes, I said it was free. So if you want to head over to drivethrurpg.com, just type in The King's Road and you will find my free campaign toolkit. It is its own setting and its own world that you can use to run an epic fantasy campaign, or you can just mine it for ideas and take things out of there and steal those and use those in your campaigns. Like I said, it's free. I really hope you get a lot out of these interviews that I do each and every Wednesday. I know I sure do. It is so much fun being able to talk to game designers, filmmakers, writers, novelists, and just hear what they have to say about running games, about telling stories. I am just having a blast doing this podcast for you all. And today's episode is no different. I have a returning guest. And guys, this episode is packed full of ideas that you can use at the table right now. So here's the interview. Today's guest is becoming a regular on the DiceGeeks.com podcast. He is the writer behind the Molten Sulfur blog, Tristan Zimmerman. Tristan, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks, Matt. As always, it's wonderful to be here.
In the episodes when you're on, we've kind of developed a little format where we take 3 historical topics or situations and just kind of talk about those and just get into them and just see how they can be used at the gaming table. Because on the Molten Sulfur blog, you write primarily about historical topics. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the Molten Sulfur blog is a weekly blog where I put out gaming material drawn mostly from real history. Been branching out a little bit now into literature, but mostly real history and folklore. And what I usually do is I talk about some really cool or interesting event or person or place in the real world or in real history or in real folklore, and then talk about how to use it in a gaming perspective, whether it's to use this location as an adventure site or to use this event as an adventure hook, or how this particular person might be a terrific NPC. And yeah, I mean, it's always a good time.
And not only do you get some great stuff for gaming, you just learn a ton by reading those articles on the Molten Sulfur blog. So if somebody is not familiar with your blog, they should head over and check that out. So now, like I said, what we usually do is we usually take a few these historical instances and we just take a look at them. And so let's just dive in so people can learn about how to use these in their games. So the first one that you had written about was the Caddo Lake. Can you kind of break that down for us and let us know the situation that was going on there?
Sure. So Caddo Lake is a lake in East Texas / Northwest Louisiana. It's the border runs through the lake, I believe. I initially published about Caddo Lake in a book that I put out a few years back, written by Haley Lundy, called Archive: Historical People, Places, and Events for RPGs. So if you want to know about Caddo Lake, you can head over to the blog, or you can check out the book Archive. But Caddo Lake, it's a maze of bayous and wetlands and backwaters. It's it's a proper lake, 8-10 feet deep, that sort of thing. Spanish moss, cypress swamps, alligators, all that good stuff. But in the mid 19th century, Caddo Lake was notorious for being an outlaw haven. The area that the lake was in was called Old Monterey. It had a racetrack, it had cockfights and saloons and brothels. It supposedly had a murder every day. There was robbery and piracy. Jean Lafitte, the notorious pirate, supposedly had deep connections to Old Monterey. And kind of growing out of this swampy backwater criminal haven comes this super weird gang war, because at a certain point in 1841, in fact, a bunch of locals decided they'd had enough of all this nonsense, and they formed a vigilante organization they called the Regulators. And the Regulators, as is not uncommon for vigilante organizations, the Regulators quickly proved themselves to be even worse than the criminals that they were supposedly opposing. If they just suspected that you might be a criminal, then, hey, you might disappear in the middle of the night. They might find you hanging from a cypress tree the next morning. I mean, the Regulators were not nice people. They were a cure worse than the disease in many ways. And so other people then formed their own vigilante organization. It was the Regulators. And the moderators and the Regulators then went to war in this swampy backwater. And this led to just all kinds of killing, including the murder of a sitting senator in the Republic of Texas. And this kind of all came to a head in 1844 when there was finally a truce negotiated between the two groups, only after the government of the new and not long-lived Republic of Texas intervened. It was like, no, this is patently unacceptable. You cannot keep doing this. And truce was negotiated, but theoretically, you do hear some suggestions that disputes and feuds as late as the late 20th century can still kind of be traced back to this war between the Regulators and the Moderators. Today, of course, Caddo Lake is just a really nice, I don't know if it's exactly a state park, but a state park type thing where, you can go and get airboat rides and go canoeing and go see alligators and raccoons. But yeah, I just think it's a really cool adventure site. It's a swamp plus Mos Eisley Cantina plus Hatfields and McCoys plus Gangs of New York, all in one place, which is just wild.
It's definitely rich with opportunities. Now, making it gameable, kind of what were you thinking? Were you thinking the parties taking up sides as the Regulators and Moderators, or were you thinking of the party maybe being dropped in as outsiders and having to navigate through kind of these politics?
So there's a lot of different ways you can tackle it, right? And being dropped in as outsiders, like maybe you just need to go to Caddo Lake for something completely unrelated to all this nonsense, right? Like, to go back to the Mos Eisley Cantina example, like, you just need to find a smuggler who can get you out of the Republic of Texas or out of whatever fictional setting you have dropped something modeled on Caddo Lake in. Hey, you need a smuggler, or you need a man killed, or you need to buy this particular illegal substance, and Caddo Lake's the place to go do it. But you get there, and of course, you're immediately robbed by criminals and then suspected of being a criminal yourself by the Regulators. And then because you've been talking to the Regulators, the Moderators think you're a Regulator. And, now you've got 3 different groups all trying to kill you. Maybe militiamen from Dallas are riding in. They're like, that party of PCs, they do seem to be awfully involved in all these violences. Let's get them too. So you can totally do it as an outsider with people having to navigate. You can also definitely pick sides. With picking sides, one thing you're going to need to be very careful to do is differentiate the Regulators and the Moderators, because it can be very easy to fall into the trap of just making them identical, right? They hate each other for unspecified reasons, and 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It kind of doesn't matter what you side with. So whenever in an RPG you frame a situation where there's 2 competing factions and you have to choose between them, not only do you have to have aesthetic differences, right? Like, look different. There has to be an actual practical difference between them Otherwise, it's just saying, well, one of these groups is all men and the other group is both men and women, so I guess we'll go with the less sexist criminal organization. That's not interesting. And what it kind of boils down to in that case is asymmetry, is making the two groups not symmetrical. If one of them is more powerful than the other, cool, all of a sudden they're very functionally different. One is dominant, the other is the underdog. That's an interesting choice to make. If one of them is based in the depths of the swamp and the other is has their headquarters in a floating shack out on the lake, cool, now they're different. But you have to do something to make them feel really distinct if you want to really bring it to life.
I think it's pretty easy to see how you could just take kind of this swamp-like area and put it into a fantasy setting for, say, Dungeons and Dragons, because kind of that world lends itself to lawlessness and stuff. What other maybe either settings or game systems do you think this would run really well in?
I would definitely see this as a great setting for Call of Cthulhu or Lovecraftian type adventures. There's a Robert E. Howard short story, one of his horror short stories. That's the guy who wrote Conan the Barbarian. Yeah. One of his horror short stories was set in a place very much like Caddo Lake, a swampy backwater. It's super racist, but other than that, it's a really good horror story. So definitely setting something Lovecraftian in this swampy backwater bayou. One of the things that I really like about Caddo Lake that lends itself to this is it's actually really far inland. It's straddles the border of northwestern Louisiana. So unlike a lot of so-called backwater bayous that really have free access to the Gulf of Mexico or to another large body of water, that really means they're not nearly as isolated as you might want them to be, because you can just get on a boat and go anywhere. No, like in a pre-modern setting before there are highways, Caddo Lake is isolated by the ecology, but then it's also doesn't have easy access to a body of water that can take you anywhere. So that isolation, the claustrophobic horror of the swamp pressing in on you, and then the untrustworthiness and villainy of the people who live there, I think lends itself well. I guess not even necessarily to Lovecraftian horror, but just like horror more broadly. You can do some fun Hills Have Eyes type stuff back in Caddo Lake. What about you? What kind of genre fiction do you think would fit well here?
I think obviously you hit it with the Lovecraftian. Of course, I think the original Call of Cthulhu story was in the bayou, right? But the cultists were located in the bayou and that. So, I mean, obviously having a swamp here, and I think you're onto something there too. I think there's always something about the swamp, right? It's just that, well, it's kind of interesting. When I first started self-publishing some RPG resources back in late 2015, and then in early 2016, I wrote a little game master guide talking about wetlands and swamps and things, and just using the terrain as kind of adventure hooks and complications. And so I think it does lend itself to horror in a number of ways, of course, because the swamp is dangerous, right? There are alligators, and if you fall in, it might be 2 inches deep or 2 feet deep, or it might be 20 feet deep. You just don't even know.
Yeah, there's no way to know.
Yeah, there's no way to know. Also, the water is stagnant and brackish, and it is easy to lose your way in a swamp because of all the tree growth and things like that. So it is easy to become lost. And then, of course, continuing with the horror aspect, there are always the chance that there is a person living in the swamp who has disconnected themselves from society because they are a crazed killer or something like that. And so you kind of combine all of those elements into a swamp. But then I think, too, in this specific one, when you add in the kind of the lawlessness idea of possibly a town almost built within the swamp, or areas where, there could be like a saloon or gambling houses, things like that. I mean, it just becomes kind of rich with just so many different possibilities. As far as other settings, I think, the biggest problem would be kind of a modern setting, because like you say, the Caddo Lake has turned into just a nice place where you would camp on the weekend or something like that and go fishing, because obviously now we're able to map out so many things, and we're able to get in touch with everybody with cell phones and things like that. And there are probably park rangers who patrol the area and things that wouldn't have been present in a more lawless time. So I would think that you would want to put it in a historical period where there was less reach, or into some setting that has had a breakdown of law and order. And then you can really then play on some of the aspects of the terrain and just amplify being lost in a dangerous swamp.
One thing to build on that, of course, RPG settings tend to be places without much state control, because if everybody's very law-abiding, well, not only are there fewer adventure hooks, like breaking laws is primarily what player characters do, even if they're good guys. But in a setting with too much state control, like kind of a dictatorial or authoritarian fictional setting, Caddo Lake could be a really interesting place to hide out, because it's or someplace based on Caddo Lake in your fictional setting could be a really interesting place to hide out, particularly if you lean into the idea that the war between the moderators and the regulators continues to reverberate through the past, and you show up in this place and you're like, all right, this is where we're going to bed down. There's deep swamp, and we canoe back there, and it's going to be hard to root us out. But then you've also got all these locals who have never been particularly thrilled about state control anyway, and have their own long simmering feuds and disputes. Also are very much opposed to the will that used to be imposed on them from Dallas and is now being imposed on them from Washington. They can let you bring a lot of those same plot hooks forward into a 21st century equivalent fictional setting.
I think that is a great idea, because you can definitely use that if the player characters are fleeing from kind of a dystopian, kind of dictatorial society, and they're escaping this control. So they're going to go to some place where there's lawlessness, but then they realize that there are problems with lawlessness as well, right?
Well, great job, everyone. We've escaped to where there's lawlessness. Unfortunately, it turns out there's lawlessness here.
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's just different people wanting to murder us and make our lives difficult for just different reasons, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think that would be a great setting for any campaign or adventure, or just to drop into if you happen to be running something similar. And I think too that it's easy sometimes to overlook, if we're playing like D&D just kind of in a straight fantasy setting. I think it's possible often just to say like, okay, you're traveling through a forest. You're in a forest. You're going through a forest. When if we just throw in, oh, well, you're coming to a swamp. You have to travel through a swamp. And I think some of, just varying that terrain a little bit can really break your game out of, there's a pun in there, but kind of out of stagnation, right? Because kind of leave the forest behind once in a while and have your party go into an area that's a swamp. And I think you'll see that some players will be like, oh, I've never played in a swamp before. And that can just open up kind of an avenue of gaming that some players may not have experienced before. And then throwing in kind of this lawlessness, Mos Eisley kind of place with the regulators and moderators fighting just adds just layers and layers on top of that.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in variety in RPGs, right? If you're doing the same thing more than 3 times, it is no longer interesting. And that goes for terrain type just as much as it goes for, plot hooks and everything else.
And two, we talked possibly about a modern or a near future, and then we talked about some fantasy, and then we talked about like Lovecraftian. Of course, sci-fi. We've been mentioning kind of Mos Eisley as the model. I think it would be unique if you put kind of a Mos Eisley type sci-fi city on a swamp, even though, in Star Wars, we saw Dagobah, but obviously there's no cities there. But if you kind of just relocate Mos Eisley into a swamp, I think that would also just add some variety that maybe some of your players haven't seen before.
The tricky part with swamps in science fiction is that one of the things that makes swamps kind of have the feel that they do is they have a real impact on freedom of movement. You need a boat, and even if you have a boat, you're moving slowly, and it's all very twisty, and it's easy to get lost, like we talked about. With science fiction, most of that disappears. If everybody has a spaceship or a hover speeder and perfect maps and, AI driving and all that stuff, a lot of the flavor and texture of the swamp is still there, but ceases to have an impact on the plot, which kind of makes it feel less colorful. Not that it can't be done by any stretch of the imagination. Heck, with the Dagobah example, one of the things that Empire Strikes Back does very quickly is removes Luke from his technology, right? Like, we're just going to go ahead, we're going to sink this X-Wing in the swamp, and cool, now you are Swamp Dude, and here's a little wrinkly green guy. So I'm not saying you necessarily would have to strip PCs of their fancy technology, but it is something you would at least have to be aware of.
Yeah, and of course that would be a kind of while seeming like a convenient solution to help the story along, it also would make sense if you're talking about kind of a lawless area, because that a certain type of people don't want to have their faces and their retinas or their fingerprints scanned very often. They might gather in a place where some of that technology doesn't work or is hard to come by for some reason. But in sci-fi, you would either have to make it, Star Wars is a great example because they don't have some of the technology that say that like Star Trek, where you could just scan the whole planet from orbit and get an exact map of everything out like that. Star Wars usually kind of plays with that technology a little different. And so I think in Star Wars, it would work fairly well. Star Trek, where you can just map the whole swamp before you beam down or whatever. I think then you would have to lean into kind of the moral or the ethical questions between the regulators, the moderators, some of the other, the bandits, and maybe just some innocent town folk who are caught in the crossfire.
Yes, very much so. Though that said, Star Trek has never been afraid to say, well, there's a weird energy magnetism on this planet. So whichever of our advanced technologies would tidily wrap this episode up in 5 minutes just doesn't work here. So that's definitely... in a sci-fi game, you can always throw a little technobabble at your players as long as everybody's clear on what the effects of that technobabble are, right? Like, hey guys, here's 2 seconds of technobabble, and then let me lay out this list. Hell, you could even do it as a handout. Like, let me put this handout on the table. These 5 pieces of technology won't work on this planet because, boy, the rocks underneath the swamp are funny, and as a consequence, none of your retinal scanners will be able to scan retinas for science reasons. And as long as you're really communicative with your players, they don't feel like, wait, which of our technology doesn't work? I had this whole plan, and then we got to the part that really matters, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, the technology that you were counting on doesn't work, right? You don't want that. That's why you communicate. But yeah, a little technobabble.
There is definite precedent, as you say, in Star Trek for doing that. Also for like telepathy powers, right? Counselor Troy couldn't read somebody's thoughts or emotions if that was just too integral to the plot. So there is definitely precedent for throwing up a barrier when necessary.
Yes.
We covered this one quite a bit. I think there's a lot, not only adventure hooks, but just a lot of things that you can do with the Kato Swamp. Now, one of the other historical periods we wanted to look at was some palace intrigue in kind of the ancient kingdom of Mali. And can you frame that one for us as well?
Sure. So less ancient, more medieval.
That's right.
We talked, I think maybe the last time I was on or the time before that, about this 14th century Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta. And he was, it was a guy who really liked to travel and traveled all over the Muslim world, and he wrote down his experiences, and he's a really integral historical source for us because some of the stuff that he was writing down we kind of don't have other sources for. And one example of this is he shows up in the kingdom of Mali in about 1352. And Mali, the kingdom or empire, depending on which terminology you prefer, of Mali, included much of what is today the nation state of Mali. So it was a sub-Saharan African kingdom, and he Ibn Battuta arrives in the capital city, which I believe he never names, interestingly, and starts reporting on this really wild palace intrigue that's happening at the time. The king is a man named Suleiman. And Suleiman, listeners may have heard of the king of Mali, Mansa Musa. Mansa is a title; it means king or emperor. Musa was his name, and this guy is Mansa Suleiman. He is the brother of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was 2 Mansas ago. So anyway, Suleiman is married to several people, but one of them, his senior wife, is a woman named Kasi. And Suleiman and Kasi rule as co-equals. Only Suleiman is the Mansa, but Kasi is very much an equal ruler with her husband. She is very fully a monarch in her own right. And then Mansa Suleiman kind of deposes her. He imprisons her in the home of one of his military commanders and appoints one of his subordinate wives, one of his lesser wives, to the role of senior wife. And this woman is a commoner named Banju. Kasi is not a commoner. In fact, she's Suleiman's cousin, so she's very much a noble, an aristocrat as well. And so cool, now, according to Suleiman, Banju is the senior wife. It's not clear why he did this. Ibn Battuta doesn't tell us. One thing that's conceivable, he could have had stronger feelings for Banju, who was almost certainly younger than Kasi, or he could have just been tired of sharing power with a co-equal ruler. He could have wanted a senior wife, a queen, that he could control in a way that he could not control his own cousin. So either way, Kasi is not interested in just being imprisoned. She's gonna fight back. So while Suleiman has the loyalty of the army, Kasi has the loyalty of the family. Suleiman has the hard power, but Kasi has the soft power. And her family is, of course, also Suleiman's family, and they're also the royal court. So Kasi's sisters start visiting Banju, the new senior wife, to congratulate her on her queenship. But as they do so, they very obviously omit the proper signs of respect that you would give while talking to the queen or the empress, which is throwing dust on your head. They do not throw dust on their head. And then they go visit their sister, Kasi, who is imprisoned. And when they go visit Kasi, they do throw dust on their heads, indicating, hey, you are the real queen. And this is very embarrassing for Suleiman. And Suleiman tries to have his cousins imprisoned, but then he later pardons them because they're his cousins. Like, what the heck is he going to do? You want to try executing your own cousins? See how that goes. He grudgingly lets Kasi out, and then Kasi starts making this kind of long show of her legitimacy. Every day she travels to the palace at the head of a long procession of slaves, all of whom have dust on their heads. Cool, great, good job, Suleiman. You are winning, right? With scare quotes. You are the one in charge. You still have the loyalty of the army. What you say goes. But Kasi is making you look like an idiot. Kasi is making you look like a fool. He's making you look like you don't actually have any control over your own court, and there's kind of not much he can do about it. So he starts looking into Kasi's background. He starts investigating her. And he seizes one of Kasi's slaves. We can infer that he tortures her. Ibn Battuta doesn't say it explicitly, but it's also one of those things where it would have been such standard practice that Ibn Battuta wouldn't necessarily feel that he had to say tortured. He could just say question. And this slave reports that she had been passing messages between Kasi and Kasi's brother Jatal. Now, Jatal had been exiled. Jatal was not around anymore because of unspecified crimes that he had committed. And Kasi is, according to the slave, sending messages to Jatal saying, hey, if you come back, I will arrange things so that Suleiman is gotten rid of and you will be the Mansa. Is this true? Were these messages ever passed? We have no way to know, right? Even Suleiman apparently only has one source for this information, who probably revealed it under torture, which is highly unreliable. Jatal, Suleiman captures Kasi. He tries to imprison her. Kasi flees to the home of her imam, where she claims sanctuary, and then Ibn Battuta just leaves the capital, and we have no idea how this story ends. You know, we have this wild story of palace intrigue and the kind of this conflict between hard and soft power, and then Ibn Battuta just leaves, and he's our only source for this happening. And so we don't know how it ends. I think that the lack of sources is a real tragedy. The Kingdom of Mali was highly literate and wrote a lot of stuff down. We still have a lot of these manuscripts, but they are mostly sitting in libraries, unread and untranslated. There are processes ongoing right now to digitize these documents, which will hopefully speed up some of our knowledge, but it is very frustrating to know that this knowledge is probably not lost. It's still present. It's just been forgotten. And we know where the knowledge is, but we don't have enough researchers focusing on medieval Mali to be able to give us an answer. But anyway, that's a total digression. So for me, I kept emphasizing in that the conflict between hard and soft power, because that kind of speaks to my interests here. But this, you always have to be careful, right? When you're talking about real historical events, to ascribe thematic elements to them, right? Because these are real people living real lives, making real decisions. Real people don't make their decisions because of grand historical forces, right? They make them because of other reasons. But boy, is this really emblematic of the tension between hard and soft power. In this case, hard power is the power of force. It is the power to coerce and compel. It is the do what I say, or I will have you thrown in prison, or I will have you executed. It is the power of armies and of police forces. That is hard power. Kasi is very much has soft power on her side, and soft power is the power of tradition and of legitimacy. It's the power of family ties, and often simply of, well, we've always done it this way. Religious power is often soft power. If you don't do what the person with soft power tells you to do, you may not be thrown in jail, you're probably not going to be killed, you may not be exiled, but you will suffer other consequences. And in this instance, these are consequences of legitimacy, consequences of making someone look like a fool, consequences of making the court think, hey, maybe Suleiman isn't this big bad boy king that he tries to put himself off as, and if he's not a big bad boy king, maybe I don't have to do what he tells me. And so if you are using a situation modeled on this in your fictional campaign setting, I would definitely, if it were me, I would definitely play up this hard power versus soft power thing by making sure to theme your fictional NPCs that are based on these two historical figures appropriately. So your Suleiman analog, he's hard power. Maybe he is a reaver king or a general or a dictator or something, and he wears a very martial uniform, and he's got a whole bunch of medals on his chest, and there's a bunch of songs about what a badass he is, and very, very much identify him with force. Whereas Kasi might be a religious authority or a beloved, democratically elected figure, someone with a mandate, someone with the ability to make people do what she says because they want to, or they think it's the right thing to do, or because they think it's traditional. A tribal elder, someone with tradition or religion or family on their side. Yeah, I mean that's 100% how I would do it.
So are you envisioning then like the players kind of becoming involved in this and having to maybe acquire something from the king or the queen and having to play in this? Are you suggesting actually play in the palace, like play different characters in the palace and have to navigate some of these situations?
I think both are totally valid. Of course, depends on what kind of campaign you are already running.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big believer that my job is not to present cool campaign ideas. My job is to present things that you can drop into the campaign that you are already playing, because speaking as a GM, like, I don't need more campaign ideas. I already have more campaign ideas than I'm ever going to be able to run. What I need is something for game on Saturday night, right? Like Saturday night's coming up and I don't know what we're going to do yet. So if I am running a Palace Intrigue type campaign, yeah, absolutely. You would naturally slot this in as, hey, so two important figures at court are now starting a rivalry, and you have your goals. This character over here is trying to firm up a business deal. That character over there is trying to ensure that his son is appointed to this important political appointment, and the feud between two NPCs that has suddenly burst into life is upending all of your plans. And how do you work with it? Do you try to negotiate peace between them? Do you try to take advantage of the sudden chaos as an opportunity? How do you put your plans back in order after they've been knocked asunder? On the other hand, if you are running a more rollicking adventure type campaign, then I see this as a complication. You already have your existing, hey, we're in town in order to steal the diadem of the Crypt Lord or whatever. But you were expecting a pretty straightforward smash and grab, and instead the whole city is metaphorically on fire because the king and the queen are fighting. And there are patrols in the street, and there are these constant parades of slaves with dust on their heads. And, everybody's loyalties are open to questioning. And, people who before might have just been like, oh, yeah, I'm the innkeeper and it's 2 coppers for the room. Now these people are saying like, well, it would be 2 coppers for the room, but you're going to need to convince me that you're on my side because I back Kasi, not Suleiman. And all of a sudden, what would have been a straightforward mission now becomes much more complicated.
I think that scenario that you just described there, again, could just be just something out of the ordinary that somebody hasn't tried to tackle before, because once you kind of create that specific situation, even if you rub off Molly a little bit and we're set in some fantasy kingdom, once you start playing that dynamic, it just adds so many complications to, whatever they're trying to get, that gem or the diadem. And they're just like, oh, now, we just have all of this extra baggage that we have to deal with instead of just trying to break into some place or something like that. And I think it opens up the idea of the possibility of playing different sides or different loyalties, of talking to the king, and maybe he's then asking you, oh, I could give you the diadem, but you got to help me with this problem over here that I'm having. And then the players might be like, oh, that sounds great. And then you realize, oh, it involves him imprisoning his wife and things like this. And then you're like, oh, well, that's not as clear cut a situation as maybe first thought. And it just seems like it just adds quite a bit of complications into what could have been just a straightforward kingdom.
Another thing you can do with respect to that is, instead of having this be a hard power versus soft power dispute, you could have the dispute break down on lines that reflect a tension that is already present in your party. So if if half your party is dwarves and half your party is elves, it's not a hard power versus soft power dispute in the court. It's an elves versus dwarves dispute. if you have, I'm trying to think of a good example from a campaign I've run recently. If you have a party that is split in its focus, I had a party I ran recently for a few sessions, where kind of half the party was very externally focused. They were all about, exploration and pushing outwards, and half the party was very internally focused. They were all about politics inside their little village and, determining who winds up on top. And of course, the way you make that work is you make what's going on out there impact what's going on in here. So both parties want to be both outside and inside. But you could make that kind of an outside versus inside dispute in the court. That way you can get your player characters to take opposing sides, which can often be a really good time if you pit the PCs against each other.
This works very easily in kind of a fantasy setting because you're basically in a medieval time already. And I think it would work well in a science fiction setting because you could, if you're running something like Dune or, that has flavors of Dune or even a Star Wars setting, you could almost just be remembering like Queen Amidala and some of the kind of the politics there that were involved in some of those movies. Would there be any type of like Lovecraftian or modern take on this?
I do not see room for a Lovecraftian take just because this is a deeply human sort of thing, and Lovecraftian horror is all about the inhuman. For a modern take, yeah, absolutely. We decorate up our hard power versus in the West, we tend to decorate up our hard power versus soft power disputes a little differently, but you can absolutely have a hard power versus soft power dispute when the army or the guy in charge of the army is saying one thing and the democratically elected representatives or the religious authorities or simply the way we've always done things points in another direction.
My thoughts of Lovecraft would have only been if the party kind of stumbles upon an ancient or a lost city that was like trapped in an ancient time. And so they're kind of thrust into it because of this city where these people who are, whatever they're doing, they're worshiping the deep ones or whatever, but then they're also having this kind of thing, and they're a lost city that's under the ice in Antarctica or something like that. That was kind of my only thoughts for kind of a Lovecraftian one there.
That is one that could be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I'd just like to mention one other way that you can swing this as kind of grand historical forces. And that is that you can also look at this as one of as a dispute based around religion and gender and historical tradition. A lot of West African societies historically, less so today, but historically, practiced matrilineal inheritance of power. The rulers were still usually men, but then the next king is not necessarily the son of the current king, but often the son of the king's brother, the son of the king's sister. And so power flows and inherits through the woman. The complicating factor of that is that Islam is much more patriarchal in how inheritance works. It privileges sons over daughters in inheritance, and so in the time period that we're talking about here in medieval Mali, Mali's only been Muslim for about 100 to 300 years. And that's the sort of thing where if you have a kingdom that started out with matrilineal inheritance of power, and then at some point is going to have patrilineal inheritance of power, at some point you're going to have a split. And we could be looking at that split happening right here, where Suleiman and Kassi's intrigue is kind of part of a larger culture war between indigenous Malian traditions and outside Muslim traditions. And if you want to do something like that, if you want to have kind of an outside traditions versus inside traditions thing going on at your party, you can just make sure that the PCs are strongly embodying their respective cultures, right? So your Suleiman analog is all about the new, all about the outside. He dresses like a foreigner. He prefers to speak the foreign language. Most of his best friends are foreigners. He worships foreign gods. And then your Kasi analog is just like hyper traditionalist. She talks in these and thous. She wears fashions that you're like, man, that is super old-timey. Why are you wearing something that old-timey? She, may disdain technologies that were introduced by foreigners. She could just be like obsessive about her indigenous religious practice. You can also definitely interpret the situation as being an external cultural influence versus internal cultural influence feud. And you can play it that way at your table. Though, again, giant asterisk, you have to be careful when interpreting real historical events in terms of themes, right? Because they're real people, and real people don't make their decisions that way.
I think that's an interesting take as well. And then, we'd been mainly talking about, somebody dropping this into their kind of their existing campaign. If somebody was starting a new game, I'd almost think if they wanted to play out the palace intrigue element to kind of the furthest extent, it might be a good opportunity to try out, say, like drama system or something like that, to where you could actually play some of these and spend your capital on getting things done that you want, but you have to work around kind of these complex situations of power.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Yeah, I think we covered that one quite a bit. Yeah, we'll have to talk about Mansu Musa sometime, right? Because he was a fascinating character. Isn't he the one who launched 1,000 ships headed toward the Americas?
Oh, no. So that is a different guy.
Oh, that's a different guy?
That's amazing. Like, that story is amazing.
Yeah, maybe we'll try to cover that one when you come on the podcast again. That is an amazing story. That is,
if it ever happened. Like, that's one of the ones where it's like, oh, we have some evidence that it happened, but also the evidence is like not super reliable, and it's great. I love it.
Yeah, so maybe we'll put that on the list to talk about at a future date. But that is some incredible stories. The history of medieval Mali is something else. It's just and the city Timbuktu and all that gets drawn in. It's just amazing. So the next one, though, we're going to switch gears a little bit, although staying kind of in our history vein here, and we're going to talk about a dragon horde.
So this is the Völsunga saga. It is an oral story from 13th century Iceland. The Völsunga saga tells the story first of the Völsungs, a wild and savage familial lineage. But the part that we're going to talk about here is the second half of the Völsunga saga, which talks about the adventures and misadventures and intrigues and dragon hordes of a guy named Sigurd. Now, some of you in the audience are going to feel like, wait a minute, I have some deja vu on this, but for characters with different names. This story in different versions is also very well known from the Nibelungenlied, which is from the late 12th century, the Poetic Edda from the 13th century, and the famous opera, the operatic cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, by Richard Wagner. That's the one that gave us the Flight of the Valkyries. So very similar story. The names change. In this case, our protagonist's name is Sigurd. In others, he is Sigmund or Siegfried, etc. But anyway, so you have this. This is all set in a period called Heroic Germany, which is a name designed to evoke the heroic age of ancient Greece. Right, you're the time of Theseus and Heracles, when you have all these great events happening in a pseudo-historical time period. This is the same thing, but for Germanic history. So we're talking about the era kind of just after the Roman Empire has retreated out, and as all these various tribal groups, Germanic tribal groups, are setting up new kingdoms in places like Francia and Burgundy. And the man who said it, and it's a very explicitly non-Christian setting, which is interesting because for the most part, composing stories were themselves Christians, but this is a setting full of Odin and Loki and dragons and dwarves and not so much saints and Jesus. But so the guy who's setting the wheel and spin here, he's a guy named Sigurd. He is the last male scion of the Völsungs, and he is the most Völsungish Völsung ever to Völsung, and that is saying something, right? His aunt once tricked her own brother into impregnating her so she could bring forth a werewolf child to kill her husband out of revenge for him killing her father. Like, these people are wild and violent and very good at violence, and Sigurd is the most Volsungish of all of them. And he kills a dragon. He kills a dragon named Fafnir. He takes its dragon hoard. The hoard includes a ring that is cursed to bring death to whoever owned it. Obviously, owning that ring didn't work out super great for Fafnir, and it's not going to work out super great for Sigurd. So Sigurd is traveling all over the Germanic countryside, having adventures, and at some point he meets his true love, a woman named Brynhild. And Brynhild is a warrior woman. She's a shield maiden. You know, she is all about participating in the wars of men, and she is aggressive, and she has sworn that she will only marry a man who knows no fear. So, of course, her and Sigurd, match made in heaven. They instantly fall deeply in love with each other. And Sigurd, gives Brynhild the cursed ring from Fafnir's hoard, because he doesn't know it's cursed, as a token of his promise to get married. But Sigurd's young. He's got adventures to go do. He gives her a promise that he will come back and they will get married and everything will be great. But let me go have some more adventures first, honey. So off he goes. And he falls in with another family, the Gjukings. The Gjukings are, they're another Germanic family. They're headed up by a woman named Grimhild. Grimhild is a powerful witch. She's kind of a master planner, and she gives Sigurd a potion that she disguises as beer that makes him forget Brynhild. So he drinks this beer, and he forgets that he has promised to marry Brynhild. He forgets that he's ever met Brynhild and that he's hopelessly in love with her. And so he says, well, these Gjukings, they seem like nice guys. We get along really well. Sure, I'll stick around here. We're going to have adventures together, and everything's going to be great. And he marries Grimhild's daughter, a woman named Gudrun, who's a sensible, good-hearted woman, kind of for most of the story, the only decent person in the whole thing. He swears an oath to become blood brothers with Gudrun's brother Gunnar, and Gunnar is Sigurd light. He is, he's a Germanic warrior, so he's very capable in battle and he's very aggressive and all that. But he can't hold a candle to Sigurd, and I very much read the text as with the relationship between them as being like hero worship, that Gunnar is best friends with his hero that he looks up to. And so they go off on an adventure. And Gunnar has told Sigurd, hey, there's this woman named Brynhild, and I want to marry her. And Sigurd says, well, that sounds like a great idea. I've never heard of this woman. I'm definitely not, deeply in love with her. So let's go find her and win her hand for you. And Brynhild has set herself up in this tower and surrounded by fire to keep out any but the truly fearless man. In other words, Sigurd. Gunnar is not brave enough to ride through the fire, but with the help of his mother's magic, Gunnar and Sigurd swap forms. So now Gunnar looks like Sigurd and Sigurd looks like Gunnar. And so Sigurd, disguised as Gunnar, rides through the flames into the tower and is like, hey, lady, I am here to marry you. And Brynhild's response is, well, I was really hoping you would be Sigurd. But I did promise I would marry anybody who rides through the flames, and I am a woman of my word. So, okay, let's do this. You seem pretty cool. You're clearly fearless. And Sigurd, disguised as Gunnar, says, awesome, let me take this ring away from you, which is the cursed ring. So now Sigurd has the cursed ring again. Let me give you this other ring, a ring from Gunnar, as the token of my affection. And then they ride out together, and everybody returns to their proper shape. Gunnar and Brynhild get married, and then things go south. because the magic potion that made Sigurd forget that he fell in love with Brynhild starts to wear off. And Sigurd remembers, like, oh no, I am hopelessly in love with Brynhild. And I don't love my wife Gudrun at all. And Brynhild is just making fun of Gudrun because, like, your husband Sigurd is so lame and my husband Gunnar is so cool. He rode through the fire for me. And until Gudrun kind of can't take it anymore, like, you're just constantly making fun of me and being a dick. Like, how about you not do that? Let me show you this ring that my husband Sigurd has. It is the ring he took from you. The man who rode through the flames was not Gunnar, your husband. It was my husband Sigurd disguised as Gunnar. You were tricked. You were deceived. Take that. And this kind of breaks Brynhild's heart. And Gudrun's heart is, of course, already broken because she is head over heels in love with Sigurd, and Sigurd doesn't really love her. And Brynhild is outraged, as well she should be. She was deceived. She was betrayed. And she starts provoking her husband Gunnar, Sigurd's blood brother. My honor has been slighted. You need to kill Sigurd. You need to kill the man who has so betrayed me. And Gunnar is like, well, Sigurd's my blood brother. Also, he's really good at fighting, so even if I could kill him, I wouldn't want to. But everybody works together. And there is a younger brother. Gunnar has a younger brother, and they get the younger brother to agree to do it. And the witch mother, Grimhild, whips up another potion, this one made out of snake meat, that drives the younger brother into a frenzy. And the younger brother bursts into Sigurd's room while Sigurd and Gudrun are asleep in bed together. And he kills Sigurd, but Sigurd is, of course, the greatest warrior of the age. So even as he is dying, he leaps out of bed, kills the younger brother, and then dies in the arms of his wife, whom he never really loved, but who loves him with all her heart. Brynhild, once Sigurd is dead, Brynhild says, oh my God, what have I done? I've brought about the death of the only man I've ever truly loved, and she kills herself. And so now Sigurd is dead, and Brynhild is dead, and the little brother is dead, and everything is ruined. And Gudrun, she runs off to Denmark because she, like, her life has gone awfully off the rails, and she just wants to grieve. So she flees her family, and she runs off to Denmark. But Grimhild, Gudrun's witch mother, can't let sleeping dogs lie. She is a master planner. She is someone who sees the long view, and having an unattached daughter out there in the world is a wasted opportunity. That is a daughter who could be married off to someone to enhance the family's holdings, to enhance the family's wealth and prestige. So she tracks down Gudrun and says, hey, there's this guy I need you to marry. His name is Atli. He is actually Brynhild's brother. They are Brynhild, the dead, the suicided Brynhild, and Atli are of a family called the Budlungs. I need you to marry Atli. And Atli's a cold and cruel man, and Gudrun really doesn't want to, but if there's kind of one consistent character feature she has through the whole story up to this point is that she is obedient and dutiful, and okay, I'm not going to like it, but I'll do it. And Gudrun and Atli get married, and it's a cold and loveless marriage. And enter a guy here named Vingi, and Vingi is Atli's, he's, I promise, the last character I'm going to introduce. Enter Vingi. Vingi is a counselor. Vingi is a trusted advisor to King Atli. And Vingi is kind of a Grandma Wormtongue type character. He's somebody who can tell what what's really in your heart, and he can bring out the worst in you. And he knows that Atli is greedy, and he tells Atli, hey, Atli, remember the great dragon hoard that Sigurd had? Well, Sigurd is dead, which means that his wife Gudrun should have inherited the dragon hoard. And since you're married to Gudrun, that means you should have inherited the dragon hoard from her. And boy, boss, I don't know what to tell you. I don't see any dragon hoard here. Like, you have to get that dragon hoard because it's yours by right. And Atli, who's very greedy and cruel, says, you know what? You're right. I do want that dragon hoard. That dragon hoard is mine. Gudrun tries to talk him out of it, but nope, he will not be swayed. That dragon hoard is mine. Of course, the people who are still in control of the dragon hoard has never moved. It's still back with the Duke, it's still back with the witch Grimhild and Gunnar, the blood brother of Sigurd. So Atli's trying to get the dragon hoard from them, and they're not having any of it. So Vingi arranges a feast between the Budlung army of Atli and the Gyuking army of Gunnar. They're all going to have a feast together. And Gudrun tries to warn her brother away from showing up. It's all a trap, but he won't listen. He shows up, and of course it is a trap, and the Budlung army kills the Gyuking army, and Gunnar is killed. And great, good for Atli. Of course, Vingi is killed in the fight too. Gunnar, as soon as he realizes he's trapped, the first thing he does is kill Vingi. Take that, Grandma Wormtongue, off with your head. And it is unclear what happens to the witch Grimhild. Like, we just don't get a good answer for what happens there. But Gudrun, the wife of Atli, is terribly distraught at all this. Once again, her life is filled with ruin and woe and despair, and her heart turns against her husband Atli, who never really deserved her in the first place. And she is so filled with vengeance and hate that she kills the children that she and Atli have had together, and she roasts their hearts and serves their hearts to Atli as for dinner. And then she locks the Atli's hall. She bars all the doors while Atli and all of his men are inside the hall, and she burns the hall to the ground, killing Atli and all of his relatives and all of his men. And then she is so distraught that she throws herself into the sea to drown, but her heart is so blackened that the sea itself will not take her and spits her back out unharmed. Obviously, this is a real rollicking, wild, grim, awful story. But what it is it's a great set piece for an adventure, because where you want to have your PCs kind of roll onto the scene is right before the big feast, right? When Atli and Vingi have set their sights on the dragon's hoard, and Gunnar and Grimhild have set their sights on retaining the dragon's hoard, and poor Gudrun is caught in the middle, caught between them. And what you have here is a situation ripe for a third party to get involved. So you have a third party get involved here, and there's a dragon hoard, and boy, any player character worth her salt is going to be interested in a dragon hoard. And who wins the political dispute that is starting right here will determine who gets to keep or gain this dragon hoard. So you're going to have these two different sides both scheming to acquire the PCs, because the PCs could shift the balance of power. Both sides have an army. They're relatively evenly matched. Having the PCs on your side could tip the balance in your favor. But even within the sides, there is room for room to be swayed. Vingi to me, the counselor, the untrustworthy guy, seems very much like the sort of guy who might switch sides if he felt there was profit in him, in it for him. So the PCs could potentially get Vingi to switch sides. Grimhild, the witch, long-term planner and not super distressed about petty things like morality. If the PCs... she was perfectly willing to have her younger son die in order to get rid of Sigurd. If the PCs can convince her that it's in her best interest to switch sides, maybe she would be willing to switch sides. And of course, poor Gudrun, she's caught in the middle. She could go for either side, and ultimately she sides with her blood relatives over her husband, but after it's too late to change anything. And so what you've got here is kind of two shifting sides, with the PCs as a third party here being swayed, and perhaps, if they're smart, doing some swaying themselves. And yeah, I mean, this is absolutely the sort of situation that a good GM can milk for 1 to 3 sessions before this kind of house of cards that the PCs are creating with their shifting alliances and their negotiations, and we'll work for you, but hey, in exchange for half the hoard, we'll betray them to work for you. And hey, did you hear? We just agreed to make a deal to betray you, maybe if you offer us more, and blah blah blah. And oh no, now we've crossed too many times. Now both sides are gunning for us, and after 1 to 3 sessions of shifting sides and politics work, then the whole house of cards will invariably all come crashing down with as much bloodshed as possible.
Yes. And I mean, obviously that is a very convoluted kind of situation to throw your players into, because there's so much going on. And of course, since there's a dragon horde at the heart of this, like, you just don't even have to change anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's D&D ready right there.
Yeah, it's already D&D, so you're good to go. I was just thinking about it, as you were kind of laying that out for us, and thank you for doing that, because before we started recording, I was mentioning that I had read a number of these myth cycles in the ring cycles and stuff when I was in college about 20 years ago, and it was just like, you just get to this point to where you're just like, everybody's dead. You just know it's coming, right? You just like, I don't like any of these people, and everything is going to go wrong, and oh my goodness, what is happening? And then yes, even the person who you're like, I was rooting for this person, has had enough at the end and just like obviously goes insane or something. And it's just like, that is kind of the character of some of these stories, that is just like, there is convoluted family ties, convoluted marriage ties, always greed involved, power involved, and then it never ends well for anybody.
Yeah, if it ends well, if you do a situation like this and it ends well, you are doing it wrong.
Yes. And when the player characters arrive and kind of their moral and ethical kind of considerations are kind of pulled back and forth a little bit, yes, they should be marching out of that kind of area, that region, with just fires in ash in the kind of in metaphorically in the rearview mirror, right? And you're just like, and have all of them just be like downcast as well, just being like, what on earth was that?
and maybe with a giant haul of gold with them, like, maybe. Hey, they might win, though. If they do, at least the version that we're doing here, the Völsunga saga version, it is not clear what becomes of the cursed ring. The last time it is mentioned is Gudrun showing it to Brynhild to say, "Haha, you were deceived." And so quite possibly that cursed ring is still in the dragon's hoard. So if you wind up hauling off this wagon full of riches, and that cursed ring is in there too, like, good luck, everybody.
It would be beautiful and catch the eye of a character who is a little shifty already.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this situation, just the way you've laid it out, I think that is great just to drop into your existing campaign if you're just looking for something to really give your players a challenge. But I think also, I mean, there's just a number of elements here that can just totally be taken out of the situation and just used almost ready. Just like the idea, I think, of a dragon horde, we're usually just think, oh, well, you kill the dragon, you get the dragon horde. Well, there's going to be consequences to that, right? There's going to be consequences to if a dragon has been killed and there's this giant horde kind of laying open and having multiple claimants. I think it's just very easy to take that, just kind of take some of those ideas and some of those elements and just even use some of those while you're running your campaign.
Yeah, I mean, the sudden appearance of just enormous wealth cannot help but create jealousy and the appearance of undesirable elements, and like, that's going to complicate your characters' lives. It almost has to.
Or perhaps your party, perhaps they have, you've been playing your campaign for a while and you have them come up against a dragon and they defeat the dragon and they've now acquired this dragon horde, instead of that just being like the end of your campaign or something, because now they're so fabulously wealthy, they can just do whatever they want. You can definitely add in some of the complications that we see here, or even looking back at The Hobbit, you can just have, once that dragon's dead, there's going to be a lot of people who have some claims on that gold and say, well, look, that gold wasn't like earned. That dragon stole it from us, right? Like the dragon didn't do work for us, right? They stole it from us. And so you could just have like a whole bunch of claimants all kinds of different claimants to show up and just be like, well, we at least get part of it because our town was wrecked. Oh, we get part of it because they stole it from us 200 years ago. Oh, well, we get it because this. And actually, I own this land that the dragon stole from me. It's on my land. I should get this. And you could just add all of those kind of things in, so you just don't have an end of a campaign with your campaign, your players sitting on top of a dragon hoard or something.
I really want to play that adventure now.
Yeah, actually, I kind of do too.
Now, one thing that I will point out for running something like this is your players will probably be tempted to resort immediately to violence, right? If Atlee dies, the whole situation just ceases to exist, right? Like, you can look at that and be like, oh, well, we got 5 NPCs who are alive and kicking right now. Atlee, he is the weak link, because if Atlee dies, Vingi is probably not going to be able to take control of his armies, and cool, then the Gyukings just win automatically. That outcome is boring. That outcome is dumb, and you don't want it. And the way to prevent that from happening, or if the PCs wind up siding with Atlee, if they can just kind of bump off Gunnar and or Grimhild, same problem, right? Now, instead of having wheels within wheels and backstabbing and double dealing, now it's just like, well, boy, that rogue, he sure rolled high on his stealth check, and he's in their fortress, and yep, he sure stabbed that person while he was sleeping. That is boring. So the way to prevent that from happening and to have your whole adventure just be over in 30 minutes of gameplay is to protect your major NPCs behind multiple layers of security, right? It's the army is guarding them, and they have assassins of their own, and you might have assassins going back and forth, but their focus is on countering the other side's assassins. Because, yeah, if you can just resolve the whole thing with a simple stealth check, then that's dumb, and it defeats the entire exercise. So protect them, keep major NPCs safe from harm, with credible defenses, not just like, well, guys, I'm the GM, I say they're going to be safe, so they're going to be safe, and I don't care what you roll. Like, that's dumb, that's not fair, that's cheating. And don't let it come to violence until you reach that horrible point where, like, oh my God, there's no way this can end except bloodshed, and then the whole world is awash in scarlet, and the adventure ends.
All right. Well, Tristan, we've been on here for a long time. We have given, I think, the listeners a ton of material they can just drop right into their games and run with. So where can people find you online? And tell us just a little bit more about your books real quick before we go.
So you can find me at moltensulfur.com. On Twitter, I'm at Molten Sulfur. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me by searching for Molten Sulfur. The Molten Sulfur Press line of books, I have 2 out right now that are collections of things like this. Moments from people, places, and events from real history and folklore, ready to drop right into your existing campaign settings. They are called The GM's Real World Reference and Archive, Historical People, Places, and Events for RPGs. I also have a collection of one-shots out right now called Making History, 3 one-session RPGs, which I happen to think is really excellent. Each of the 3 one-session RPGs have everything you need to play, including pre-generated characters, an adventure or plot, and a very simple, stripped-down rules-light rules system designed specifically for that adventure, so that it is a rule set that is designed specifically to run through this set of events that really focuses attention exactly where it's focused. The 3 one-session RPGs there. One is a horror adventure set on a U.S. Navy ship where you wake up one morning and discover that you are totally alone on a ship that should have thousands. One is a murder mystery set in the real medieval Native American city/kingdom of Cahokia. The murder mystery, your detectives will get in over their heads real fast. And one is a game about heritage and faith set in the Viking Age. And yeah, you can find all of that at moltensulfur.com.
And as always, I will provide links to your blog and to your books in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening, if they just head over to dicegeeks.com, you'll find the links there so you can check out Tristan's blog and his books and his RPGs. All right. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Always a pleasure, Matt.
All right, guys, there you have it. Man, Tristan and I were able to cover a lot of ground today, diving into some of these historical events. There are ideas and situations galore that you can just take right now, drop them in your games, and just level up your game mastering. Now, as always, I have provided links to Tristan's website and his books that are available on drivethrurpg.com. Those links are in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So if you just head over there, you will be able to check out Tristan's blog and check out his books as well. Now, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show, and you will get a weekly update on what I am doing here at dicegeeks.com. If you enjoy these conversations each and every Wednesday, then I would humbly ask you to support the show in some way. You can tell a friend, you can share it on social media, you can leave a review, you can subscribe. You can also head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and support the show financially. That would mean the world to me if you did any of those things. And I sincerely mean that, guys. I just wanted to thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.